You're battling effectively this invisible enemy that can basically be everywhere.
He became a completely different person.
I'd say that hundreds of thousands of homes are affected in some capacity.
There's mould on the International Space Station. You can't escape this.
When I heard that it was mould causing the issue, I was really surprised.
How could these microbes be so harmful?
Good evening, I'm Mark Fennell.
And I'm Alice Matthews. This is The Feed with stories from right across Australia, and a little later on we'll have a very special guest joining us in the studio. But first, could your house be poisoning you?
Yeah, so there's a growing number of Australians who reckon that they've been misdiagnosed with things like depression, insomnia, a whole host of chronic conditions. And they say that the real cause of their illness is actually something that's hiding in plain sight. The question is, though, are they right?
You're battling effectively this invisible enemy that can basically be everywhere. It's dampness and mould. It's everywhere. You know, there's mould on the International Space Station. You can't escape this, right? So back in 2016, we bought what we thought was going to be our dream house in Barden, a few suburbs over from here. And we thought that would be the house our kids grew up in. And my wife and I were both employed. I was doing my PhD, hopefully on track towards academia, and life seemed pretty good.
He's always been an amazing dad. He's just so much fun with the kids and so loving and caring, and always had time for them. And from when they were newborns, just always having them like on his chest and cuddling them and being really caring and patient and understanding.
Brisbane awoke this morning a smaller city as the river slowly swallowed whole streets and suburbs.
In 2011, there were the very significant floods here in southeast Queensland involving the Brisbane River. There was a lot of houses in the lower lying suburbs that were completely flooded as well.
People were hearing the lady scream, and yeah, it's just horrendous.
The past few days have been very harrowing indeed, and that there are still more dark days ahead.
People needed help, so you go and help. So I went out with a friend, and we were volunteering in one of the worst hit suburbs, where some of the lower houses had basically been completely submerged. But I had a number of symptoms that started right then. One of the worst was probably chronic insomnia that started from that very night. I never actually slept, and I very much struggled to fall asleep and to get a sufficient amount of sleep for about the following 9 years. And then we moved into our house at Barden in 2016, and that actually did have some pre-existing water damage. And at that point, we had basically water coming through the ceiling in our kitchen and in our living room. And the kids were running around with sort of, cups and pots and pans trying to collect it. And it was very shortly after that, my entire body just started to seem to fall apart. The first was a very severe headache, really migraine territory. And that remained constant for 4 weeks straight. It seemed like there was this constant tremor in my body. It got to the point where I simply couldn't handwrite anymore. Well, I just simply couldn't control my hand properly. I started to get strange chest pains as well that were worrying enough that I took myself down to emergency at the local hospital, almost like I was covered in something like a rash. I was struggling incredibly with basic things like memory. At one point I told a doctor I couldn't remember a single memory of my children from their entire lives from the past 8 years. I wasn't the same person that my wife had married. I wasn't any kind of happy or loving personality. I wasn't the father that my kids were used to either.
He became a completely different person, and it's so hard to see someone you love going through that. But I guess also the uncertainty of not knowing what was causing it, not knowing what was going on, and just not really knowing how to help or what to do next.
We were going to see a lot of doctors. A lot of the standard blood tests were coming back normal. There's a frustration that you feel sicker than you've ever been in your life, and you simply weren't getting anywhere. And you start to get doctors looking at you like you're making up, like it's all psychosomatic. And you sort of get to a point of sheer desperation, really. That's terrifying. Yeah.
When I heard that it was mould causing the issue, I was really surprised initially. It honestly hadn't occurred to me.
I still have moments of thinking, this is utterly insane. How could these microbes that we sort of co-evolved with for hundreds of thousands of years be so harmful? But it's a strange situation.
So the first thing I look for when I enter a home is odour. So if I can smell a damp, musty smell, it's a good indication that there is a mould problem. And the next thing I look for is to try and define where that moisture source is, because what mould needs to grow is moisture, oxygen, and organic material. And if we have those things, then we know that we're going to have a problem. The species of mould that's harmful to human health are the ones that are mycotoxin producing, and they're the ones that people need to be aware of. So we've got some white mould growth along the curtain here, which is Aspergillus penicillin. On this wall we know where the moisture is. If we come across certain scenarios where there's been water damage for an extended period of time, and we start to see things like stachy, which is black mould, and that's the toxic mould. So people who aren't particularly susceptible to mould, they can be living in a house and not know that it's there. Then someone who is a little bit immunocompromised comes into the house, then they'll start feeling those health effects. So the most severe cases I've seen in people's homes following severe flood events, you've got houses who have been submerged in water. You've literally got 24 to 48 hours to dry before we get a mould issue. So it's extremely difficult to fully get rid of mould. If you do have a moisture problem, get it fixed straight away. Based on my experience the past 5 years, I'd say that hundreds of thousands of homes are affected in some capacity with mould.
Chronic inflammatory response syndrome is a condition which affects the whole body when certain individuals have been exposed to a water damaged building. And so it's not just a runny nose or sore throat or some of those localized symptoms that most people associate with mold-related allergy, but it's something that can affect any part of the body and is often quite debilitating. Certain people are genetically predisposed to getting CIRS. There appears to be a genetic susceptibility in around 24% of the population. Some really common symptoms are fatigue, anxiety, abdominal pain, insomnia. There can be skin rashes, diarrhea or constipation, and there can be something called brain fog, which is a term we use when people's memory and concentration and their ability to take in new information is really badly affected. So it can be very severe in some cases. It's a little bit of a silent syndrome for many people, and often they go to many doctors and practitioners until it's finally diagnosed. Well, they can lose their whole life. They basically all of a sudden are no longer able to live in the home that they may own or that they're renting. They may not be able to work anymore. They may have huge financial losses, like it's very expensive to get treated for this condition at the moment because most of the medications and tests and so on are not available on Medicare. Dr. Scott McMahon in his paper in 2017 suggested that the prevalence of this condition in America may be up to 10 to 12% of the general community, which is huge. It's actually more common than asthma. So that would take us to millions of people.
CIRS is not an accepted medical complaint in Australia from both neither the Department of Health nor the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners recognise it as a distinct syndrome. While it could be an existing syndrome, the evidence for it, as far as I'm aware, is not very strong.
Well, it's a relatively new condition. It still hasn't hit the medical schools as yet, and it hasn't really hit into the mainstream medical education as yet. And that's because it takes a certain amount of time for new research to actually filter down into medical education.
As it stands at the moment, there is no good link between mould exposure and symptoms that have been described. Animal experiments have shown that the amount of material needed to produce significant reactions is unlikely to be achieved in a home environment, and the range of symptoms are very non-specific and don't seem to link to what we know about how mycotoxins cause damage.
Everything new or emerging starts off on the fringe until it's accepted by the majority, and that's just the nature of medical knowledge. However, that doesn't mean that it's incorrect or not solid. There is already a good, solid research base to suggest that this is a real condition that's affecting people all around the world.
People are desperate for an answer, and so they will often find an answer in places where the answer isn't actually an answer, but it allows them to cope with the fact that they have this intractable issues that don't seem to respond to any conventional means.
I lost hope more after the diagnosis. When you get told the bad news, I guess, and when you get told it's going to be a very long road back to health, and there's barely any studies about treatment, and not everyone does get better. Right? That's when you lose hope.
Sean was still just starting his treatment, and it was still early stages. He wasn't getting out of bed, he was very withdrawn, and that's when he said to me that he had just given up. And yeah, we had to take him to emergency because I was terrified. He said that he just didn't want to go on anymore, he couldn't see the point. I was terrified that I was going to lose him.
It takes an incredibly long time to recover from this illness, because even after you've started treatment, you're still incredibly reactive to your environment.
And I've seen many, many people recover from this condition. And I think the more it's recognised, the more people will be able to see hope when they develop this condition and realise that they can get through this.
You know, I'm one of the lucky ones in how well I've recovered. I can concentrate again, I can think like a normal person. You get back a certain amount of joy and purpose in life that you don't have with this illness whatsoever.
He's a new person. It's lovely to have Sean back to being his positive, happy self, and really, like, you can just tell that he enjoys life again, and he's close to his children again.
It's painful to think of how I was in some ways, and the years that were lost there where you were not an ideal parent, when you were mentally absent or just not the loving parent that you usually would be. But, you know, I think we're back on track now.